the Texas Senate yesterday. Now, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. Back in 2001, Senate Bill 1 passed the Texas state legislature. It banned Harris County, that's Houston, from keeping polls open late into the night or overnight so that shift workers could vote, while expanding early voting in rural counties. It lets the state throw away absentee ballots that don't come in with the voter's driver's license number attached without telling people that their vote hasn't been counted. It makes it a felony for any state employee to mail out an unsolicited absentee ballot. It requires election officials to do monthly purges of voting rolls without notifying voters that they'll no longer be able to vote. It provides new legal protections for so-called partisan poll watchers. They're actually recruiting like Proud Boys down in Texas to be poll watchers, and it makes it a 1-year in prison offense if you try to stop them or confront them. And it maintains the state's lack of convenient online voter registration, making it the most difficult state in the union to vote in. Now, that was 2 years ago, to set up, you know, Greg Abbott's election victory in the election of 2022. Now they're coming back with a brand new piece of legislation that would allow the Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State, to throw out all the votes in any county with over 2.7 million people if the Secretary of State believes there are any irregularities in the count. Now, interestingly enough, the county that has Dallas has 2.6 million people in it. It votes Republican. The county that has Houston, which votes Democratic, has has 4.7 million people. It has over 2.6 million. So in the law, they made it any county over 2.7 million people. Right. As the, I mean, this is just one small piece of a much larger effort. As the Texas Civil Rights Project noted, in just the first 4 years after 5 corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, Texas Republicans closed 1,173 polling places in mostly black and Hispanic counties that had previously been protected by the Voting Rights Act. You know, but none of that was enough for them. As the Houston Chronicle noted 2 days ago about this effort now to be able to throw out election results in Houston and then say, and now the state has to have a new election that has to be paid for by the county, or now the county has to have a new election that has to be paid for by the county. And of course they want to do this because they know that special elections have very low turnout. And that low turnout always favors Republicans because the people who can most easily vote are the people who are salaried, upper middle class white people mostly, and people who are retired, you know, the aging Republicans in Texas. And, you know, this is pretty straightforward stuff. Out of the 254 counties in Texas, only Harris County, only Houston was selected for this. And this is, you know, a county now that is led by people of color, as the Harris County attorney pointed out. 4 years ago, in the Hidden History of the War on Voting, I wrote about this, and not this specifically because it hadn't happened yet, but, you know, basically voter suppression in general, and how Republican secretaries of state across the nation were vigorously purging people from the polls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, were purged off voting rolls in just the 2 years leading up to the 2018 elections, according to NBC News. In North Carolina, now this again after the Voting Rights Act was gutted by 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court. In North Carolina, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the largest African American populations. Leading up, this was just before the 2016 election, the Donald Trump election. This led to a 16% decline in African American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide Hispanic voters wait 150% longer than white people do in line. Black voters wait 200% longer in line. In Indiana, when then Governor Mike Pence passed a rigorous new voter ID law, it produced an 11.5% drop in African American voting in Indiana. I mean, this is why we didn't get President Al Gore or President Hillary Clinton. We would have gotten both of them if it wasn't for voter suppression. Down in Florida, Jeb Bush knocked 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls so that his brother could win by 537 votes. Or we would have had President Al Gore if it had been illegal for Jeb Bush to throw those people off the voting rolls. And, you know, the same thing in 2016. I mean, I just gave you the statistics, 11.5% drop in African-American voting just in Indiana because of a law that Mike Pence passed. Well, it was happening all over the country. By 2016, the Republican Party had really fine-tuned this voter suppression machine. The New York Times reports in 2017 that just in Wisconsin, this is in the 2016 election, about 17,000 registered votes were turned away from the polls because of a new ID law from Scott Walker. In 2018, Greg Palast sued a number of Republican secretaries of state and got his hands on purge lists that included 90,000 people in largely Democratic parts of Nevada, 769,000 people in Colorado. Keep in mind, this was when Colorado was, run by Republicans. 340,000 people in Georgia, 469,000 people purged in Indiana. I mean, in the dissent in the Husted v. Randolph case, this was the case in 2018 where 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court said, yeah, it's fine. You can keep purging people from voting rolls. This was the Ohio Secretary of State. Stephen Breyer pointed out in his dissent, and I quote, "The record shows that in 2012, Ohio identified 1.5 million registered voters, nearly 20% of its 8 million registered voters, as ineligible to remain on the voting rolls because they changed their residences." And he points out that's 20% of the state's voters were kicked off for moving when on any average year, about 4% of Americans move. How do how do these numbers come? Well, they just, hey, brown people, black people, college towns, let's just purge them. Calling the findings disturbing, the Brennan Center said, quote, "Almost 4 million more names were purged from the rolls between 2014 and 2016. This led up to the Trump election. Then between 2006 and 2008, removed voters represented an increase of 33%, far outstripping growth of both total registered voters, 18%, and total population, 6%. I mean, this has been their strategy for years and years and years, to throw people off the voting rolls. Now, on top of that, they're waging their culture wars, but the culture wars are not all that popular among most Americans. 3 out of 4 Americans are decent people. They're not Trump humpers. That's only about a quarter of us. Is this going to work for them in 2024? Depends on how many of us turn up.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Really, the only way to rescue, essentially, this country is to make sure everybody you know is registered to vote.